Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm going to be talking about the alleged disappearance of bands. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So I had a whole different video set up to go for today. But there's this video that's been making the rounds. I saw it maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. It's a clip from the Rest is Entertainment podcast with Richard Osman and Marina Hyde. Richard Osman is a British. He's an author. He's a TV personality. He's a game show host also. So they were talking about what the premise of their conversation was, at least this clip of their conversation, was about the total disappearance of bands in modern music. And what they kind of boiled this all down to was that this was primarily due to this like hyper individualization that's gone on in the last 5 or 10 years. And what they're primarily looking at was the fact that there are very few bands in the music charts over the course of the 2020s. I'll show you a clip from this conversation, just kind of give you a general idea of how their conversation went. But I'll put a link down below in the episode description here if you want to watch the full video.
Has happened that is utterly extraordinary in the charts is the complete disappearance of bands. We've had half a decade, okay, roughly so far, the first half of the 2020s. So I looked at the first half of the 1980s. And in the first half of the 1980s, there were 146 weeks when bands were number one. The first half of the 90s, there were 141 weeks when bands were number one. So you've got 146, 141. In the first 5 years of this decade, 3 weeks.
No.
We have had 3 number one weeks, one of which was the Radio 1 Live Lounge All-Stars, most of whom were soloists anyway. One of which was the Beatles when they had the lovely comeback single, and one of which was Little Mix, and that's the only kind of official band who've had a single week at number one in this entire decade.
Oh my God.
Isn't that crazy?
Is it sort of a sort of hyper individualization of things nowadays?
Yeah, I think 100% that. I think also, there are various cultural things in that, if you come from, the London grime scene, then it's very individualized on. So people will collaborate an awful lot, but you wouldn't collaborate necessarily in a band. So there's lots of little reasons. But essentially, if you look at all of those names and the bands who are around, and everyone was in a band, no one is in a band anymore. Even this week's top 40. There is not a single band formed in this century in the top 40 of the singles charts or the album charts.
So first off, I'm not sure what music charts he's referencing. Well, if you look at, so they're both British, so I'm assuming they're looking at the UK charts. So if you look at their album charts, let's go look at their album charts first. So this is the album charts, the number one albums on their album charts in the 2020s. I'm going to look just at 2020 to start with. You've got Green Day in February was number one. 5 Seconds of Summer in April was number one. The 1975 in May was number one. The Killers were number one in August. Doves were number one in September. Idols and Queen were both number one. Actually, the Vamps were number one in October. AC/DC was number one in November. This is all just in 2020. Those are all bands. So it's kind of like I know that they're looking at the singles charts, the UK single charts. But I think it's kind of a really bad representation to look at that and kind of take that information and kind of extrapolate that over the entire music industry when the singles charts have always been dominated. Even going back to the 70s and 80s, the singles charts have always been dominated by individual artists. So there's a total of 9 albums by bands that were number one on the albums charts in the UK in 2020. If you want to fast forward to 2024, you've got several that have been on there so far this year. Green Day was number one in January. The Last Dinner Party was number one in February. Idols was also number one in February. I know Idols is a duo, but I'm still going to group them in there. Elbow, which I've never heard of Elbow before, was number one in March. Caspian was number one in July. So, that's what I'm saying is like, I don't know where they're making this argument from. It's interesting because we no longer live in this like shared musical universe. Back when I was growing up, most people would find their new music through the radio or through like MTV, entities like that, where a majority of people watched or listened through those. We no longer live in them. We live in this very like algorithm-based society now, where you pick up your phone, you open up your favorite streaming app, and the algorithm kind of force feeds you whatever the algorithm believes you want to listen to. So I feel like I spent a lot of time over the last several years, maybe not so much on the channel here, but in my personal life, making these arguments with people about whenever they talk about rock music being dead, or in this case, bands being dead. It's complete nonsense. There are a ton of great bands out there. Are a lot of them in the mainstream? Maybe not, but that's kind of getting back to what I was talking about with the whole algorithm-based music society that we live in now, where it's sometimes hard to kind of break outside of that and find new and interesting stuff that maybe you're not being fed to by Spotify or Apple Music. And that is one great thing about groups like the Vinyl Den Facebook group, or there's other Facebook groups out there also, where there's a lot of people in there that are just putting up albums, talking about music that I've never heard of before. I've discovered so many great bands through social media and other people's recommendations that I wouldn't have known about had it not been for entities like that. But there are a ton of great bands, both old and new. Bands like AC/DC are still making really good albums. Blink-182 just released a good album. Like, there are bands that aren't necessarily like legacy bands. They're still making really good music today. They've been around for decades and decades. But there are also a ton of younger bands that have come up over the last 5 or 6 years. They're making great music also. They're just not necessarily like in the mainstream. So you've actually got to go out and know where to find them. And that's where it kind of makes it difficult. And that's where I said you've got to be, I think, a little more educated today on where to find new music at. It's not as easy as it once was. But a lot of this comes down to taste. And I always talk about music being probably the most subjective form of art that we have. So there's a lot of new music out there. There's a lot of really great bands out there. There's new bands in the mainstream also, but you might not like them. You might not like their style of music. So that's kind of a different argument there. I don't like the fact that people are that they're throwing out this like blanket statement that bands just don't exist anymore and really aren't relevant today. And like I said earlier, I'm pretty sure they're using mainly the UK singles charts as the proof for this conversation, or the evidence for their conversation. But if you look back at the 1980s here in the US when I was a kid, the singles charts were dominated by single individual artists back then also, whether it was Michael Jackson, Madonna, George Michael, David Bowie. So if you use that as like your measuring stick, you might come to the same conclusion. But yes, there were more bands that made the singles charts back then than there are today, but it's one of those instances where I think you can take information and kind of bend it to your argument. And Anthony Fantano made a video on his channel just not too long ago, within the last couple of weeks, where he talked about this. But he made the argument, or part of the argument he made was that it's just not convenient to be in a band anymore. It's a lot easier to just be a single individual artist, have a producer, and have that producer create the music for your lyrics. And while that's true, it is easier to do that. I think it's also one of the reasons why it's kind of led to this like vapid and hollow music that we've had today. Because that's the problem I've had with rock music over the last several years, is a lot of it, there's really nothing really challenging in rock music anymore. But that's not necessarily an issue with an individual versus a band. It's more, like I said before, it's just like that's an issue with the music industry, where labels really kind of homogenized rock music in the early part of the 2000s. But really, ultimately, it comes down to, is the music good? And that's the thing, is there are single individual artists where I love their music and they're creating great, intriguing music. And there are bands that are doing the same thing also. So that's kind of where I come down to, is why does it really even matter? Just as long as the music is challenging, it's good, it's high quality, it really doesn't matter to me if it's one person or a band. But to make that argument that bands are irrelevant, they don't exist anymore, it's just stupid. I think it's a lazy argument also. There's, like I said before, there's so many great up-and-coming bands that I'm discovering every single week when I'm going through, because like I said before, it's really kind of hard to find a lot of those newer bands. You've got to actually do some research, do some digging, and in today's society, a lot of people just don't want to do that. Because I'm the type of person that, to be completely honest, if I'm listening to the same albums over and over and over again, I get bored with them after a while. So I'm always looking for something new, something challenging to find to listen to. And sometimes, a lot of times, it's outside of the typical music that I listen to. I think this argument is kind of a victim of kind of the fast-paced society we live in, where people don't want to spend the time to go to a record store, to talk to store employees, to get recommendations, to look on the new release board every week and say, oh, I've never heard of this band, maybe I should check them out. We just kind of want to, like I said before, pick up our phones and hit play and let the algorithm decide what we listen to. And I think a lot of people out there are missing out on some really great music. But I'm also somebody that's never really looked at the mainstream or looked to the mainstream to help me decide what to listen to. I think there's a lot of people out there that would agree that being or having mainstream success doesn't always equate to high quality. And I think that's kind of true today. I think a lot of the better artists aren't the ones that are hitting the Billboard charts or hitting the charts in the UK, but they're still, like I said, making really good music. Stuff that I think is some of the best music of the last 10 years or so is being created now. And I think another factor that I think they really kind of neglected when they had this discussion was kind of the decline of rock music in the 2000s. I think country music and rap and hip hop have really become the dominant force, and really have been the dominant force of the last 20 years. And both of those genres have been dominated by individuals, really since the beginning of those genres. And in today's day and age, this whole digital algorithm-based society that we live in, to be honest, it's really just easier for a solo individual artist to put their name out there, to get a huge following on social media, than it is for a band to get that groundswell of support before they get signed to a label and start releasing albums. I know this is a really big conversation. It's a really big topic. I wanted to throw it off to you guys. What do you guys think about this? Do you guys think that there's a reason behind the dwindling number of bands in the Billboard charts? Because that is true. I mean, you look back at the 80s, 90s, there were a lot of bands on those album charts every single week, where, it is fewer and fewer these days. But, I think there's other factors out there that some people really are kind of neglecting or kind of glossing over. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.